Welcome, everybody, to the Yoga Philosophy Study Group Book Club, coming to you from the Yoga Center of Chico. I'm Lauren Carley, and with me is Tom Hess, one of the owners of the YCC. In this series, we're currently studying The Light on Life. There we go, a couple of copies of it, by P.K.S. Iyengar, and how it relates to your life, how you can practice it in your own practice. Today we're starting the first half of chapter 3, which I'll summarize, and then Tom will fill in or give his interpretation of the first half of chapter 3. Each session is recorded and can be, just like this one, and can be found on the YCC's YouTube channel. Each live session that we present at the YCC is also broadcast via Zoom. And you can get that Zoom link by going to the YCC website and look under events. These occur on the fourth Thursday of every month starting at 5:30 Pacific time. And anyone can join in, and they are free. I'm now honored. Now we'll start the discussion and the presentation on chapter 3, which is titled Vitality, the Energy Body. But before we start talking about chapter 3, I want to do a brief summary of chapter 2, because the whole book is about the journey within. It's about the journey through the koshas and how you can use the practices in the 8 limbs of yoga to help you on this journey. So let's just refresh our memory on what chapter 2 said. Chapter 2, vitality, steadiness of the body. So in chapter 2, Mr. Iyengar starts us out by thinking like the everyday common man. And most people, he says, most people only ask from their body that it does not trouble them. So most people are walking around everyday life asking that their body that does not trouble them. Well, Mr. Iyengar quickly takes us to the yogi knows that the physical body is not only the temple for our soul, but the means by which we embark on the inward journey. So right there, he's speaking now to us as yogis. And then as he takes us through chapter 2, he starts talking about how we apply our consciousness to what we do with our body. For example, he says that with increased awareness, increased conscious awareness, every pore in our body becomes like an eye. You can start to feel this sense of going from not putting your consciousness on your body at all, just wishing it didn't trouble you, to now starting this journey, conscious journey within. And moving on, he talks about, in the next section of chapter 2, once we start becoming aware of our skin, our bones, our muscles, that he talks about dynamic stretching from not just the center of the body out, say with our limbs, but dynamic stretching from the core within, the core that we're headed to on this journey. So not just a physical dynamic stretching, it's also from the core of our being. And doing that using both intellectual and emotional intelligence, he says. And I love it because he brings in the emotional intelligence here. And then he talks about relaxation in a pose, think light, feel light, and so on. And then he makes a pretty dramatic shift and talks about pain in the body and pain in the mind. It's about halfway through chapter 2. And he concludes by saying, do the asana with your soul. And on page 62 to 63, he summarizes chapter 2 by saying, I use the body to discipline the mind and to reach the soul. That the practice is taking the person away from awareness of the body towards the consciousness of the soul. So that's quite a journey right away. And I wanted some of this in part to lay the foundation for the next chapter, but also to remind everybody that in this first section, chapter 2, about essentially the asana practice in your how you consciously see your body, he takes us from the external pores, you might say, all the way to saying do asana with your soul. So it kind of feels like, wow, I already went on this expensive journey. Is there what is there left to learn about? Well, that's why there's chapter 3. Because now we're going to take a more detailed look inside to the next kosha and how it's going to relate to pranayama, pratyahara, and dharana. So chapter 3 is titled Vitality, the Energy Body. And he starts off by talking about, in yoga world, what prana represents. And he does a nice job in a couple different sections early on of giving us the idea that that term prana represents all kinds of energy that you find in the universe, you might say. Chemical energy, potential energy, energy of the mind, the energy you get from digesting your food. These aren't all the words he uses, but he gives us this broad sense. There's mechanical energy, there's nuclear energy. He does mention that dealing with prana is dealing with all forms of these energy, but what we're really focused on here is what comes to the body. Now he doesn't, later on, I think in the book somewhere, he does get into a little bit of, for example, we get energy from eating food and then digesting it, and there's a chemical transformation, some chemical energy happens. But what he really focuses on here is the energy we get from inhaling air, from breathing, as a basic place to start. And then he goes on. And he says that breath is only one of prana's expressions. According to the Upanishads, prana is the principle of life and consciousness. Prana is the principle of life and consciousness. So it gives you an idea. This isn't just about breathing. It starts there. And then he goes on to say prana is special because it carries the light of awareness, i.e. consciousness. And prana is the vehicle of consciousness. That's a term I've heard in a yoga world for a long time. Prana is the vehicle of consciousness. And if this doesn't make sense and it may not be clear, let's keep going. In yoga philosophy, prana and chitta, awareness or consciousness, are considered to evolve directly out of Mahat. This is Iyengar telling us this in this chapter. In other words, cosmic intelligence. Mahat being the universal intelligence of nature, which we call in Sanskrit Prakriti. The genius of nature's intelligence is self-expression. So you might stop and pause here and think, okay, everything in the entire universe is either energy or matter that is part of Prakriti. But look at how energy has organized itself into everything we know in the entire universe, including ourselves. He calls it the genius of nature's intelligence. I just love that. So I'm highlighting a few things here that I think really speak to what this chapter is about. Then on page 72, he says, watching the flow of breath, which is a pranayama practice, watching the flow of breath teaches stability of consciousness, which leads to concentration, which is one of the limbs of yoga. After you practice withdrawing your senses, which is also a benefit we gain from pranayama practice, then we also can gain focus of our consciousness. And he talks about it right here on page 72 with your pranayama practice. And then he briefly talks about the 4 parts: inhalation, retention after inhalation, exhalation and retention after exhalation. Now, I'm going to hold up this book. This Light on Life that we're reading is not, in this chapter we're reading, is not a full book on how to do pranayama. That is not the point here. If you want a book on how to do pranayama, here it is. Maybe it's backwards. Maybe it shows backwards on the, but essentially it's Light on Pranayama by our favorite author, B.K.S. Iyengar. So we're not talking about, except with some exceptions, I mean, he does touch a little bit on how to do pranayama, but he's really here talking about how it ties in with our inward journey. Then he goes on to describe some ways to visualize the cycle of breathing that I just mentioned: inhalation, retention, exhalation, and so on. And he talks about that some of these ways to visualize pranayama begins the withdrawal of the senses. What I just mentioned, there's asana, pranayama, pratyahara, the withdrawal of the senses. And let's see here, I can't read my own writing. Oh, withdrawal of the senses from the outside world and the external engagement with the outside world. We're going inward by observing our breathing practice. Breath and pranayama kosha serves as a bridge, he says, between the body and mind. Some people call it a hinge point. I like this word bridge a lot because you do tend to cross over in the practice. I like the word hinge too, because it's the place in doing pranayama, it's the place where you move from the physical, you might say hardcore body, into the mind, which is still part of prakriti, but it bridges you over, it carries you over. And he says you cannot look into your mind with your eyes. Now I say, but you look in your mind with your third eye, your consciousness. Okay, then he has a section on, specifically on retention after exhalation. Iyengar says, in retention after exhalation, you experience life after death. The ego's worst fear is confronted and conquered. Some strong language, strong imagery. You experience life after death. And he says the veil of illusion that shrouds the me small self is lifted. The reason why I think that is true, and at least I can speak from my own practice, and then Tom will speak from his practice, is if you observe your exhale and you watch it go to the bottom of your, what I call the bottom of your exhale, that is the point you have, and it's the only point that I know of where there's no duality. Even in breathing, you've got duality. Inhale, exhale. Retention at the top, retention at the bottom. But the bottom of the exhale, there's no duality, and you're at the lowest energy state. And this is where I think some of his language comes from. Let's see here. You're fully conscious in that state of non-duality. You're not forcing it, you're observing it. And at least I can say from my own practice that when you practice it long enough, you start observing and going to a deeper place with your consciousness, and you can start getting ideas and answers to things. At least that's been my experience. Let's see here. And Iyengar says it's an act of surrender. And once I came across that term from him in terms of the bottom of the exhale, observing the bottom of the exhale, and started treating it that way as an act of surrender, it changed everything. Then the next part of this first half of this chapter, he talks about stress. And he says our aim is to deal with stress as it arises and not to have it imprint or accumulate in the body's various systems, both the conscious systems and the unconscious systems. Now, if you're not familiar with the word samskaras, you might want to look that up, because this is a little bit what I'm sure he's pointing at is a long-term or even a short-term accumulation of stress that stays with you, doesn't get resolved, can create samskaras, which are hard to get rid of sometimes. And he says the main causes of negative stress are anger, fear, speed. I thought that was interesting. Greed, unhealthy ambition, and competition. We recognize some of these from the seven deadly sins. One of my favorite expressions is there's a reason why greed is still one of the seven deadly sins, or one of the most popular seven deadly sins. In the second half of the chapter, he's going to go into each of these in great detail. And with regards to stress, he makes some pretty good comments about the popular notion that meditation reduces stress. And his position from his experiences, meditation alone won't remove stress. In fact, in order to properly meditate, you need a stress-free situation. Only by learning to relax the brain, he says, can one remove stress. By moving from, and this is my interpretation now of what he's saying, moving from pratyahara to dharana, which is concentration, to help you get rid of it. Then you can move on to true meditation. And he also, beyond stress, he also has a little section on emotional disturbances. I'm not going to go into great detail there, but he does say conscious self-control can go a long way to dealing with the emotional disturbances, where we work, and the pranamaya kosha is where we work with emotions. So the first half of this chapter is really kind of laying the groundwork for the second half of the chapter in dealing with some real life situations that pretty much everybody has to deal with. And he says to understand, I put a big star next to this, to understand the emotions, recognize the role that the ego plays. Our emotions and our intellect must be developed for divine purposes, just like the body, just like we develop our body for divine purposes. So we have to develop the emotion and the intellect. So that summarizes the first half of chapter 3, which really is talking about the pranamaya kosha, but you notice he brings in through the practices of pranayama, pratyahara, and dharana. Those are also mentioned here. So with that, let me turn it over to Tom for him to then talk about this chapter from his experience.
Okay. Thank you, Lauren. I thought you did a real good representation of it. I just want to talk a little bit more about the relationship between breath and prana as it applies to the pranayama practice. About the retention after the inhalation, the retention after the exhalation. And your description about the retention after the exhalation is very apt. It's that time when you face the deepest psychic position of lethargy or dormancy or depth. But if you want to then build up one's prana or generate prana, that is generated after the retention after the inhalation. And one of the purposes of this whole practice of pranayama is to generate the energy needed for the spiritual journey, this inward journey that he's describing. I mean, as a normal, natural person, you can't go through this. It needs some preparation. So what he's describing here, certainly through the second chapter, is preparing the physical body through the asana, stability. Now we're in vitality, and it's a sequential thing where you're building up the body to prepare for the energy that is then created in the pranamaya kosha vis-a-vis the breath. And then later, that energy will be used for the later stages of pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and so forth. So it's sort of like you're building yourself up for the spiritual journey. You're restocking. You're getting more gear here because you know that the next stages are going to be more challenging. So that's sort of how I see that, Lauren, and everybody. I hope it helped.
I think that's an excellent addition, because I can say I've had a few experiences where you kind of get zapped by the divine energy, and it is like sticking your hand on a hot wire. I mean, you feel it in your nervous system, you feel it in your brain. It brings you to a halt, and you can only sustain it for so long. It's like touching a live wire. At least that's been my experience. A few times I've had it just sort of zap me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does take strong nerves, and it does take a lot of energy to deal with the emotions, deal with the mind stuff, deal with the ego. That can take a tremendous amount of energy. So thank you for pointing that side of it out.
Sure.
Okay, well then we'll wrap up this recording, and hopefully we'll see you on Zoom or at the YCC, and we'll be back for part 2 of chapter 3.
Take care.